Guillaume is a PhD student at the MRC Laboratory of Molecular Biology in Cambridge, and his talk is going to be concerned with the navigation of an increasing volume of scientific literature, as well as the diversity of tools increasingly available to do that work.
So now, the purpose of the talk today is really simple. It is to share some thoughts on the challenges that scientists like myself, and so in particular grad students and young researchers, face when using digital information, and as well as to illustrate my approach to digital management of digital knowledge. And so I divided my talk in 4 different parts, and I will start by giving some very general views on digital information consumption to sort of set the stage and the motivation for the key or core concept of this talk, which I call channeling flows of information, which I will substantiate later and illustrate with some of the workflows I'm using. And then I will touch upon some of the themes we've heard previously, also in Ernesto's talk and in David DeRue's as well, on the future of digital information consumption, but it will be really some very general trends, so maybe just reiterating some things we've heard before. So to start with, I thought I would give you a bit of background. Well, not much of it, though. It's just to say that I've witnessed a huge contrast in how I approach learning and how I approach knowledge in general between the time I was doing my undergrad studies back in France and now where I'm doing my PhD studies. And in a nutshell, back to the early days of undergrad, the knowledge landscape was really broad. So I was working mostly on molecular biology and biochemistry, but there was also a bit of math, physics, and so on. And it was essentially paper-based content. So it's not so long ago, it's not prehistoric. It's just a few years ago. And we were using a lot of lectures notes, textbooks, and printed articles. And on the other hand, now I have an interdisciplinary focus, a mix of systems biology and statistics. But everything is essentially digital. So I have a large collection of journal articles I need for my research and for various projects I'm involved in. I also tend to prefer to read textbooks in electronic form whenever possible. And I also have a lot of research notes that I grab from internet. Might it be from forums or Wikipedia or other sources that I trust to read at least, but cannot necessarily cite anyway because they're not research articles. Right. And so the key message here is that these are 2 very distinct ways of learning and using scientific knowledge. And what I mean by that is that learning as a student kind of feels like that. It feels a bit difficult, a bit endless, but there is room for focus and memorization by repetition. So repetition meaning that you reiterate the learning of a rather well-structured and well-established set of knowledge by exercising, by taking tests and things like that. And as I said, at least in a traditional context, it's mostly based on paper, so the interaction between like the user interface in a sense is very archaic and simple, and it really helps memorization, I feel. On the other hand, now learning as a researcher is quite of a different thing. There's a lack of horizon that comes from the fact that most of the knowledge we're interested in is ambiguous, and there's uncertainty as to whether the problems we're trying to solve even make sense in the first place. There's also an urge to stay on top and not drawn into details, but really try to identify the most important trends in a specific field. So where is the research moving towards? And also there's constant solicitations from, especially if you're in a theoretical field like mine, where everything is based on playing with different concepts, connecting different findings to find new knowledge. So here there's an explosion of opportunities and literature you might find of interest. But as well, there's also a lot of things that count as distractions in terms of how useful it is towards learning. And I think this is something really general. It's not specific at all to researchers, but it comes from the fact that most of what we use nowadays as digital devices, and this is the sort of thing my eyes see most of the day now, because effectively I'm programming, doing statistics, so I'm actually always on a digital device. And that's kind of an embarrassing thing to say, but it makes me quite impatient. And I'm not the only one. So 8 seconds is the average span of attention of internet users based on a very large-scale studies of last year, and it's already a 33% drop compared to what it used to be back in 2000. And this is not a glorious statistics when you think that the attention span of a goldfish is even greater than that, right? So it's kind of a general concern in society nowadays about this impatience. Does this make us mindless? And so there's a lot of popular literature. You find a lot of newspapers and books that are obsessed with that idea that being constantly connected and with this urge to be productive and to generate content and to digest content makes us somehow shallow and not really capable of focusing enough. And I think this is really a broad problem, but it's also a central problem to the question here, because it raises the question of what impact it has on how users actually consume digital information. Right, and so in my own case, I feel like this. So in a way to formulate this problem a bit differently, you can think of an end user like a scientist as the blue node here in this graph. And in a context where you would go to a library, for instance, to access information physically, well, you would first have a set of books you're interested in, find chapters, identify pieces of text you're really focusing on, and then move on gradually and progress in a sort of linear manner to access to key information. But this is not at all what we can expect from a digital device, especially for advanced users, let's say, or youngest generations. It really much looks like this. So instead of being on top of a chain, you're actually a hub in the midst of a complex network where all the information you want to access is really fast to access. So you're always multitasking most of the time, especially if you don't think about what you're doing. And there's a lot of distraction surrounding things. So in a way, when designers of journal article websites are thinking how to make the information more accessible, you also have to think about the fact that researchers may have a phone in their hand, they may have tons of different tabs open at the same time, and they may have other applications that might solicit their attention. So there's really a huge competition for attention in that context. And this is important because discoverability and accessibility of research is also dependent on the attention users pay on it. So in my own case, I have this feeling that I really like the control that digital devices offer me. I think it's very powerful. It allows you to process a lot of information very fast. But on the other hand, I also felt a bit nostalgic of the times where I could be a bit more mindful and focus with attention. So in an attempt to reconcile those two notions, I propose, well, it's nothing like formal, really, it's kind of common sense, but the idea of channeling information flows. So what I mean by that specifically is that when you have key objectives in your professional life that you want to achieve, like let's say typically building expertise, being excellent or really good at doing something, well, it comes from learning new skills and in the case of many professions, to solve complex problems in your organization, or in the case of an academic, to solve a research question. And this requires a lot of routine work every day, and it feels kind of slow most of the time. But this can be catalyzed and accelerated by key information. The problem is key information is rare, especially with respect to all the information we absorb every day. So what kind of information we absorb every day? Well, of course, we absorb a lot of emails, of news and tweets, RSS alerts, and we browse the internet for various random things, sometimes useful. But this is like really the major volume we get routinely. And then we also have helpful conversations and important papers in an academic context that are really important to learn new skills and solve problems. And I would say, in retrospect, it depends on the working environment you're in. But when I look back of what I did in the previous week, I can count on the fingers of my hand how many really useful conversations I had with colleagues. And I think it's kind of a lot, actually. And also how many important papers I've identified that can shape the way I think about my problems. Right. And then rarely there are inspiring talks, key encounters with exceptional people that help you to find a problem you were trying to solve or actually solve it for you. And you also have your own eureka moments. But these come rarely, and they require attention, they require focus. And so what I'm saying is that these actually provide the useful knowledge that help you catalyze your progress towards the objectives you're trying to reach. And if we're honest with ourselves, a lot of the digital content we're consuming is not necessarily doing that, especially through emails. You know, you always have, in my case, I often have colleagues asking for data set, for quick analysis, for reviewing papers, for commenting on manuscripts. All these things are actually important. They're part of my work, but they're not helping me to learn new skills and solve complex problems. So the idea I propose is just to think about how, in a pragmatic way, you know, we can, with a bit of willingness, try to dim down a bit that red edge of all this volume of information flowing towards routine work to try to maximize the information that is actually useful towards solving your objectives. And I think it's not magical. There are lots of ways of doing that, and many of which we've mentioned in previous talks. So the levers to refocus the attention are sort of with two different sides. On the one hand, you have librarians and from the librarian and publisher standpoint, leverage based on the accessibility, first of all. So we've talked about how it's important to have a robust and smart repository architecture that allows content to be quickly disseminated and retrievable, and also research management systems to understand what is being published, what impact it has, and how to retrieve relevant content. And then I also like to mention for third-party apps. So for a lot of organizations, it is sometimes very useful to rely on the innovation and creativity of other companies and other startups that can add functionalities to an existing platform. So, you know, for instance, I just mentioned the case of reference managers, where you can quickly import citations from, for instance, well, many publishers' websites now just with one click. Or that enhance the viewing experience. For instance, ReadCube does that in Willy and Library and Nature Publishing Group websites. And also the user experience is very important, and there's a lot of room for improvement all the time, and the whole key concept is to bring relevant information at the right time and at the right place so that you can minimize the amount of the information content displayed at any time. And also it's important to have something platform optimized, because the way you think and the way you act on a desktop computer is quite different from the way you act on a tablet, for instance. Right, so that's for the librarian and publisher's point of view, but from the end user standpoint, there's also a lot of work to do, and the first of all is really to adopt new habits as to how you interact with a computer. And pretty much to learn to stop distractions when needed. Right? And so it's all about self-awareness, and if it's not achievable, then you have also software that helps doing that for you. So you basically block a lot of emails and things like that, and websites that are distracting. And you force yourself to lose those habits this way. But I won't talk about that. I will talk more about building workflows, that is to say, identifying tools that can be of interest and how you can connect them to help you processing information and learning and memorizing it so that you can reuse it later on. So one point I want to mention is like there's a real golden age of productivity software for academics. And this is something I will not go too much into the detail of, but I'm happy to talk about any apps displayed on that slide later on. But the key idea is that you have recurring themes, recurring principles. At the moment, people that are developing software are really obsessed with the idea of a minimalist and responsive design, and I think that's a really good thing for the reasons I've mentioned before. Cloud synchronization of files is obviously a core component of everything, because that allows you to have applications that are cross-platform. What matters is that the content you have can be accessed from different apps and on different platforms, so it's really, really helpful. And also a notion of personalization of content. So the user might want to have her own views on how she wants to organize a particular research project and how she wants to access specific set of journals. And this is really important to give that degree of freedom to individual users. But overall, that gives a bit this impression, right? In a way, the overload of information we've heard about for about a decade now, the response to it seems to be an overload of apps. Right, so I'm not going to claim that there is any specific optimal set of tools that people should be using, but I will suggest my own workflow and try to illustrate that it's not really the app that matters, but really the function that it's doing. And so if you think of it at the abstract level, it's important to relate different functions together, and that's what I'm going to try to do in a very simple way. So like my journal workflow is really about three things. It's about identifying information, digesting it, and in a way that makes me capable of reusing it much later on. So the identification has two sides really. One is to spot the information in the first place, and it's really helpful to have methods to do that passively. That is, that you don't have to seek for the information comes to you. And also the ability to save it in a way that you're sure that it's going to be part of a pipeline and you can process it later on. So what I call digesting the information is really in two parts as well. One thing is to have a first read on an article specifically, and annotate it, and also tag and assign it to specific projects you have, specific themes you're working on, so that you can not only understand what was the information content of the paper, but understand how it really relates to your own interests. And that's really key to being capable later on for reusing your paper much later. It might be days later, might be years later, and to cite it. Because the ultimate, as Ernesto mentioned, like for researchers, there's obviously like a goal, which is to publish academic articles, although that's not only the only output we should be seeking for. And just to exemplify a bit what I mean by having various functions, you can find, I won't go too much into detail of that, but you can find global types of apps that cover a bit that spectrum. But in general, they're not good at covering everything. So for instance, on the far right, you have reference managers, and they help you definitely save papers and read them and assign them and cite them, but they're not necessarily good at everything. So the problem here, and relates to the first slide I mentioned with this pile of tools, is that there's not an optimal set of tools for that. So it's always jogging between the different blue bars here. And one aspect that is also very important is how these tools interface with typesetting software, like Word. So just to give you a brief example, for the identification, what I do is it's really definitely multi-platform. Sometimes I just wake up and the first thing I'll check is RSS feed aggregator, like for instance Feedly, or I also use Google Scholar, and I can spot papers that are really interested in my field, and I can tell you this is a very good way to stay awake, because then you realize, oh my god, I have to read that paper very quickly. And I also use reference managers like Mendeley to import them into a library that I manage with that tool. Then, I tend to split really think differently about the active reading and about the tag and assignment. So the tag and assignment the tagging of papers, I do that definitely with a reference manager. But sometimes I like to have an active reading on different platforms, especially if I'm on travel, or if I'm using textbooks. I like to not do that on a desktop computer, but do that with a tablet or actually with a paper, a printed form. And I have different tools I use for that. I just displayed some examples here. And finally, to use, so to reuse the citations, I do that at the moment in Mendeley. But that's not to say that this should be the tool people should be using. Of course, there are lots of very good reference managers. So more specifically, how do I search for new papers? Well, as I mentioned, I'm using Google Scholars because I have a Google Scholar profile, and that helps me tracking automatically papers and interest based on my own publications. I also have set actively some specific PubMed queries based on Boolean logic to say, well, if I find that keyword in the title and that keyword, then I'm interested in a paper, and they're sent back and synchronized to Feedly. And also I have, in practice, a lot of emails from colleagues, from my supervisors, from friends of different labs who might send me papers, as well as alerts. Typically, for instance, F1000 is also very useful for that. And what happens all the time is that I access the article's URL in a kind of sort of old-fashioned way. I save the PDF in a watch folder. So it sounds a bit, as I said, a bit old-fashioned, but the reason for that is that I can synchronize everything in Dropbox, and the fact that it's on a watch folder, it means that actually it's a folder being tracked by Mendeley, and it automatically extracts all the metadata from the PDF file. So I don't have anything to do, I don't have to click anywhere, and in 90% of cases, everything is fine, so I don't have any amendments to make, and everything is in Mendeley directly. But on the other hand, I can also, because it's on Dropbox, use other tools, especially on tablets, to access papers in different contexts if I wish to. So for instance, with And another interesting aspect of Mendeley is that once you have a large library, You also have recommendation engines that are really powerful. So one of them is called Mendeley Suggest, and just based on the entire library, it finds top-ranking articles from the large 3 million papers database from Mendeley users. And on the other hand, if you're really specifically interested in one paper, while you're looking at it inside Mendeley, you have a button called Related. You press it, and it finds the most relevant papers, reaching a certain cutoff score of relevance. And I find this is a really powerful way also discovering new papers that have been published before, but are extremely relevant. Now, how do I digest articles? Well, I'm not going to spend much time on that, but the idea is that there's a structured way using hierarchical classification, which I find to be very useful when writing a paper, because I can place references that are relevant to the introduction or to the results part and so forth and so on. And there's also a tag-based approach, using keywords that have been defined by the authors or the publishers, but also personalized tags that are really useful, again, to relate everything to your own projects. And using also Boolean search, it's really easy to retrieve later on. If you have a vague notion of what the title was or keywords you remember from the abstract, it helps you retrieving that. And finally, how do I cite papers? Well, there's a really classic mainstream way of doing that, which is to use Microsoft Word or its open source equivalent LibreOffice. And for both of them, you have cite as you write features in Mendeley, but the same exists, for instance, I think in recent versions of EndNote, if I'm not mistaken, and also in papers, for instance. So it's a powerful way to say, well, I'm going to stay on the same window typing my manuscript, and as I think, I can retrieve things, press enter, and insert the citations directly. And this is a powerful way, actually. It's true to cite papers. But on the other hand, Word has some issues, and they're not uncommon, they're quite well known. It's difficult to handle really large texts with Word in particular. And also the very fact that it's really linear makes the writing kind of constrained. So I don't like to start writing articles in Word. And what I'm using more and more now is a tool called Scrivener that was initially developed for Mac. And it is much, much better at composing long texts, compiling them very, very fast, and more importantly, at structuring thoughts. So you have an outline you can drag and drop all the time. I can comment on that later, and we can discuss those things afterwards. But the idea is that it's also extremely powerful to relate content to specific parts of your manuscript. But for that, there's no easy way to cite papers. So now I've just presented you a really sort of a working pipeline or a workflow of what I'm doing. Again, this is only a snapshot in time of what I'm doing at the moment, but I think the inherent structure behind it's going to stay for a while. And this brings me to the last part of the talk, which is about the notions of the future of digital information consumption, as I see it. And one of the first things I want to bounce on is what I just mentioned, some features that reference managers should have. And the first message is there's definitely more than Word and LibreOffice, and I think more and more advanced users, among which many academics are interested in using over innovative, powerful, and useful writing apps that lack compatibility with reference managers. And I think this is something that could really be improved. And the diversity of tools does mean that you have to have a lot of specific development that takes years. Sometimes there are actually some shortcuts to do things that work for many at the same time. Also, the expectation about reference managers from young users, I feel, is very much that it should be multifunctional. So it's kind of expected now to have a very advanced PDF viewer where you can take a lot of annotations and highlights and also access references quickly and be capable of downloading supplementary information from the device itself, so from the reference manager. Also, to have a recommendation engine is really useful. And a collaborative social network can also be a way to share papers quickly, and I've experienced that myself while writing with some colleagues and writing some review articles, to actually have a private group in which we could share things, but you can also have public groups where you can highlight different papers. It's a way of doing, I guess, post-publication commenting or reviewing on papers. And this is something that can be done in Mendeley and perhaps in other tools. And finally, the idea of having also some level of integration with publishers' websites is very useful. So it's pretty much the same paradigm as to what happened with Facebook. Having Facebook buttons all over the place on the internet made Facebook really essential to a lot of users and like being part of the ecosystem. And the same is happening with some of the reference managers in recent times. And I'd also like to mention again something that Ernesto said earlier. Interoperability is really important. And the same goes for reference managers, and especially for the case of full library transfer. So I think it's really a pain when you have a library with more than 1,000 papers to export it and re-import it into another piece of software. Because of course, the automation works, and you can import a lot of PDFs, but you lose all the organization you had, you lose the tags you had in the folders you've defined, and so that would be really useful to work on that. And I don't think any developer of reference manager should fear the notion of letting users free to change reference managers whenever they want, because that will help and catalyze collaboration. Finally, I just want to say some brief words about reading papers online. So that's something I do, but I could mention some statistics on the fact that it's a really odd behavior compared to the average information-seeking pattern of internet users, because you need a lot of time to read content, and that is why there's been a lot of effort towards building richly interactive formats, which I think are really innovative and useful. But at the moment, I only use that to have a quick look and understand what the paper is about, understand some key concepts before I decide to save it, and later on use PDFs to really read it in detail. So this brings me to the question of the future of PDF articles. So that's something we've heard about a lot today and yesterday. And really there are two key questions, and I'll try to very quickly address them perhaps in a naive way, but the question of whether HTML articles will eventually replace PDFs is tightly connected also to the question of visual identity of the journals. And for this first aspect, I think we should really distinguish what is the role of having an article in a format, in a layout of a PDF file, actually of a printed text with columns and so on. Versus having a specific file format. And I think the format, indeed, of PDF has been very useful for sharing documents, but there's no reason why HTML couldn't be a better way of sharing information. But the key is that you have to have this notion of file, of owning a local copy of something. I think both psychologically and pragmatically, it's really useful for users to have something like that. So what I mean to say is, if we could see HTML richly and interactive articles as files in a specific format that could be used in other apps and not only in web browsers, that could be a way to eventually replace PDFs. But the role of having a dynamic content and a static content, I think, will remain important for many years. So in summary, I've shared some thoughts on digital information consumption and what I mean about the importance of changing your habits and changing your workflows so that you can process information quickly, and some of the challenges as well about accessibility and user interface development. I've mentioned my own workflow, and I've just briefly talked about a few things, but there are many other topics like smart aggregators, like deeper insights into behavioral studies, and the role of social networks as well, and post-publication reviews. All these things, are topics I'm really interested in. So if you have also some interest in that, I'm happy to chat with you later on. And with that, I would like to thank you for your patience and to thank you for your attention. Thanks.